Hi, my name is Sachin Agarwal and I'm going to be telling you about Opta Local today. In case you're wondering what Opta is, it's a way to create infrastructure in the cloud without knowing the nitty-gritty of every cloud provider. So this means you can quickly get started with deploying your application in the cloud without having to worry about things like VPCs and IAM and Kubernetes and load balancing and what have you. Opta will do that for you in a very secure and scalable manner. But this video is about Opta Local. So let's talk about Opta Local. So let's say you're a developer and you're developing some code. And what you really want is to test and deploy this code quickly on an environment you control 100% so that you can quickly iterate through the features and the bugs without having to deploy this into the public cloud every single time, which is a slow and costly process. So that's where Opta Local comes in. And what Opta Local will actually do for you is install a small Kubernetes cluster within your local machine so that you can run your application right inside your laptop without having to go to the public cloud. And in order to do this, we will install Opta Local and see some examples in this video. So let's get started with Opta and Opta Local. In case you've not installed Opta as yet, you can head over to the installation instructions at doc.opta.dev/installation and install it for your operating system on your local machine. Once you've done that, let's go to the runx GitHub organization, which is github.com/runx. And here we've got repositories. So we've got the main Opta repository, which is an open source project. And down here, we've got Opta examples. And under Opta examples, we have this full stack example. So let's have a look at what the full stack example is, because this is what we'll be using for our demo today. So in here, what we're going to do is we are going to show how an application developer who's written a front-end server, say in Vue.js, a backend server in the Django REST framework, which is again backed by a Postgres database, can install this whole application using Opta Local on their local machine. And later we will see in the demo how this person can then easily transfer the same exact application with the same exact infrastructure as code, this Opta file that we have in this project, to apply the same application to a public cloud. So what I have done here is I have cloned this repository, this Opta examples repository, onto my local machine. And I am going to go through some of the steps here. So I go in and I first build the images that I will need. So I first build the Django API server Docker image. And next, I'm going to build the front end, which has been written in Vue.js. And it takes a while to build it, but what we end up is these two Docker images on our local machine. And now it's time to deploy to Opta Local. So I'm going to first deploy the front end. I'm sorry, the API server. And what this is doing is that it's checking if I don't have a pre-existing Opta Local Kubernetes cluster. And if I don't have one, then it'll install that particular cluster. But if I already have one, it's going to just push the changes of my Docker code into a local Docker registry, which means you don't need a Docker registry in the cloud. It's all running on your own local machine. And once it's done that, it's going to install your application into this local Kubernetes cluster. So it's working on that. So what it's doing right now is from our local host, this laptop is transferring the Docker images into Kubernetes, which is running within your laptop, and then it's starting up those applications, right? So now we are done. So let's go to the next piece of the installation, which is we install the backend. Now let's install the front end. So I'm going to again cut and paste that command. And now, just like it did the backend, it's going to go and install the front end. So in the background, Opta is actually using Terraform and Helm to you know orchestrate the infrastructure. So you can be sure that you're using very standard tools when it comes to the underlying processes to talk to your cloud, or in this case your local machine. So while we're waiting, again it's pushing up the second service into your Kubernetes cluster. And then what's going to happen is once it's deployed, we'll be able to actually access these services on the local machine, where you can kind of test it and see if it looks good or not, and iterate as a developer. So let's go to localhost 8080, and let's go to the front end. And here we've got a to-do list, and I've already inserted some data from previous runs. And let's say I add another one which says learn Opta Local, and you can see that's added to the to-do list. Of course, it's a very simple list. Of course, you can click on it, you can edit stuff. So that's the front end, but let's figure out what's happening at the back end. So you can also access the backend, the Django REST framework server. So we go to that's the one here, and as you can see here, we have access to what's happening in the backend, where you can see the GUI front. The GUI front end for the Django REST framework, and you can see what data is in there. And if you're more curious to know what's going on within the local Kubernetes cluster, you can go to the command line and use the kubectl command line tool like this. Kubectl get all namespaces, and as you can see here, we are running the to-do front end and the to-do API as pods, but of course then we've also got services to expose those services to the external world, as well as other constructs like replica sets, deployments, and all that good stuff. All right, so we've seen the front end and the back end. Now, you might also be interested in getting some observability into this Kubernetes cluster, like what's actually going on and what is the resource consumption and what have you. So you can also install a Prometheus and Grafana stack, which will then let you look at your infrastructure and get all sorts of information about what's going on. So I've turned that on. It takes a minute or so to deploy, and this is totally optional. You may or may not want to do this on your local machine. We've coded our application on our local machine, and we know it kind of works. We've iterated through it, and now we want to put it into a public cloud like AWS. So let's see how we are going to do that. All right, now that we've got Opta Local running our application and we've iterated through our code and we're happy with what it's done for us, we want to put it into the cloud. Now, before we start using Opta to push it to AWS, we're going to have to make one change in the code, and let me show that to you quickly. So in our front end, now this is a single page application. It runs in your browser. It connects to the API server backend, which is written in Django. And here the endpoint is no longer localhost 8080, but it's instead the load balancer in AWS that's going to be serving our application. Now, you would be thinking, how are we going to get the string? And This load balancer endpoint we've gotten by going to the EC2 management console here and clicking on load balancers under EC2 and copying the DNS name of the load balancer that's been created. So now the load balancer is created after we run the environmental setup command here. So let's just do that here. So where are we? Yeah. So let's see what's inside this Opta environment file for AWS. So as you can see, we're going to set up a provider, AWS. There's an account ID here. The credentials are actually environment variables in this bash shell that you're seeing. And now I'm going to just run this. Now this takes a really long time if you're starting from scratch, about 20-30 minutes. But I would say it's much faster if you run this earlier like I have, in which case it just verifies everything and says you're good to go. So let's just wait for that to happen. And while we're doing this, let's have a look at the other environment, the other service Opta files that we've created. So under the API, if I go to Opta, we use this Opta API service. Now, as you can see at the top, it says use the AWS environment, but with Opta Local, we had specified the -- local flag, which basically got rid of this whole key in this YAML file and replaced it with the local environment. But apart from that, the Opta service file that I'm going to use to deploy this to AWS is exactly the same as the Opta file we use for the local setup. And that's key, right? Because here we are saying that you have the same infrastructure as code file, which can be used to do local development. And it can also be used to do deployment to AWS or GCP or Azure for that matter. And what's kind of cool is that on the local environment we had a database which was a Postgres pod that was running in our local Kubernetes cluster, but in AWS it's going to actually spin up a relational database using the RDS service without any change on part of the user. So it kind of gives you this very high level of abstraction, which would otherwise be really a lot of work to implement. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's go back to our terminal, and sure enough, we've verified that the environment's already set up. And now I'm going to deploy the API server first. And this is the exact same service Opta file which I was just showing you. And I've already pushed this earlier, so it's pretty quick. And you can see it's going to a private Docker repository in AWS. So it's no longer the local private repository we are talking of. So while that happens, now if you remember, I changed the code a bit, right? So I changed the under the front end here. Yes, here. So I cut and paste the load balancer here. So now since the code is different, we need to rebuild this Docker image for the front end before we can make it work on AWS. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is scroll back up here, and we can just build this maybe in another window here, and it's already built. So we are ready to go. And we are done with the backend, and now let's do the Opta apply for AWS on the front end. So here's a command to do that. Same command as what we use for Opta Local, but we've just removed the -- local flag. That's the only difference. And again, it's pushing up to AWS, as you can see here. And we want to go to /front end first, right? And here we've got we've got our to-do list. So let's add All right, and likewise, we can go into the load balancer and at slash Django API, APIs v1, you can see the backend in action. Uh, and Also, we did deploy the observability stack using Opta on AWS as well. So let's see what that has to tell us. So if I go here, actually, let me just go from here at Grafana, and I'm already logged in, but the credentials are mentioned in the in the README file, and you can always change them in the values YAML file of the monitoring subfolder there. Uh, but here what you can see is you can see a whole bunch of dashboards for your Kubernetes cluster. So let's just go and have a look at our cluster, and here's what's happening within our Kubernetes cluster in terms of the aggregate CPU usage. There's a whole bunch of metrics around memory, the different namespaces and what they're using up in the cluster, so on and so forth. And also, if you want to dig in even to the per pod level, you can just choose another dashboard. For example, this particular one gives you data on within a certain namespace. So let's say in the to-do API, the Django server, you can see what's going on, and you can look at the particular pod, and you can see what's happening within a pod itself. All right, so circling back to the uh, Opta documentation, there's a lot of information here you can use. There's the getting started as well as installation. There are many integrations with products like Datadog, LogDNA, stuff like that. There are tutorials. And if you need to reach out to the community, we have a Slack channel, which is at slack.opta.dev. So you can just add yourself there and chat with the developers and the whole Opta Runx team. Thanks for watching.